Hi, Acadiana. I'm Meteorologist Dave Baker. Happy Monday to you. Hopefully you had a great weekend. Stayed pretty quiet in the tropics, although things are starting to get a little more interesting, I think, for a little bit later on this week. It's really the same tropical area that we've been talking about now for about a week to 10 days or so. As we go into the early part of November, it does appear that we're going to see at least another tropical system. Most likely, according to the computer models we have, it looks like it's going to be a named system. And the next name on the list is Patty. And then we have Raphael, Sarah, Tony, Valerie, and William. Don't know if we're going to finish out on the name list, but we do have at least one, maybe two to go before the hurricane season is over. But I did want to revisit Hurricane Zeta that hit land on October 28th of 2020. Of course, 2020 was one of the crazy years. It's the record-setting year, the most named storms of any year on record, and we had a number of tropical storms and hurricanes strike the Louisiana coast during the 2020 season. And Zeta was kind of the last one on the list that hit Louisiana, but believe it or not, we still had Hurricane Eta that was farther down the road in November that crossed over parts of the Caribbean and then made its way onto land over Florida. So even though we are ending the month of October and starting to move into November at the end of this week, hurricane season doesn't officially end until November the 30th. So we could have a couple of more systems to go before things are all said and done. So let's go ahead and look at our current conditions. We're holding at 82 degrees right now, and the heat index is 84. So again, as I'm talking about ending the calendar month of October and heading into November, we are still seeing temperatures that are pretty much like what we should see during the very early part of October. Normal highs and lows this time of the year should be in the upper 70s and then dropping to about 50 for the nighttime low. But we're going to be above that really for most of the week, even with a front that's going to be coming in later on this week, giving us a chance for rain. A chance for rain for the first time now in about 5 weeks or so. It's been a long time since we've had measurable precip here in the Acadiana region, but just some fair weather clouds that are out there right now with a lot of sunshine. And I think we're going to stay with mostly sunny skies through the day and really not much of a chance for any rain today. I think there might be enough moisture to spark off a coastal shower going into Tuesday, but I think Wednesday going into Thursday, I think Thursday is going to be our best chance for rain, but we might see a few widely scattered showers coming in on Wednesday. And I got a comment on Facebook. In fact, I was thinking about it when I went for a morning walk earlier today, is how is it that we have 5 weeks of completely dry weather, and then the first time we get rain, which is exciting, unfortunately it's threatening Halloween, so we may be seeing some scattered showers and even a few thunderstorms for trick-or-treaters there as we go into Halloween evening. So as we move along and look at the satellite imagery, not much going on locally right now, but you can see though out in the west that we do have a bit more of a trough that's starting to dig back here, and that is what's going to be affecting us a little bit later on this week. It's going to tap into a little bit of Gulf moisture that will slide northward. There's a bit of a ridge of high pressure that's right about in here, so we are getting just a little bit of an onshore flow. And last night we had the radiational cooling, so the temperature dropped down, and once it started to meet the dew point, that's when we started to get the condensation, and that's when we started to get some of the fog to develop. But I think the fog was a little bit thicker this morning because we have a very light onshore flow too. And there's probably going to be fog out there again tomorrow morning, but then on Wednesday morning, it may not be quite as bad as some of the wind speeds are going to start to pick up. It's also been a little bit of a rough day, kind of a pressure gradient there over the northern part of the Gulf of Mexico. So the winds are somewhat brisk out of the southeast at about 15 to 20 knots, but those seas, even in the nearshore waters, have been running about 3 to 4 feet and a little bit higher in the far offshore waters. So if you're watching from one of the platforms out there, I'm sure you're probably seeing some decent sky conditions, but you probably got some bigger rolling waves that are out in the farther offshore waters. And as we look at the satellite imagery, You can see there's some low-level fair weather clouds that are kind of drifting off from east to west, and then in the upper levels you have more of a west to east pattern. You can see that of those wispy clouds that are kind of making their way out of Mexico and then kind of cruising there off toward Florida, and then you can see these low-level clouds are kind of drifting off toward the west. So you do have winds going in opposite directions there over the Gulf of Mexico. And the area that we are going to be watching here is going to be the Central American satellite. And you can see there's a buildup of thunderstorms. There's a little extra moisture that's there over the southwestern Gulf. There's a departing tropical wave that's going to go ahead and move into Central America. But what's left there, we're going to see some lowering pressures here over the next several days. And that's what the models have been indicating since probably about the beginning of last week, where we were looking, boy, there's a pretty good chance that we're going to see something developing here over the southwestern part of the Caribbean going into the first part of November. And it looks like that's probably going to happen based on the different computer models that we have, and also the agreement that we have from model run to model run and from the individual models themselves. The GFS and the Euro and the CMC are all kind of a little bit more in agreement. Even the Icon is kind of coming on board, even though the Icon doesn't go quite as far out. So that area there over the southwestern Caribbean is really the place that we're going to be watching here over the next couple of days. There are a number of tropical waves, though, which is a little unusual as we get into the latter part of October, November. So you got one tropical wave that's kind of making its way onto the coast there of Nicaragua. There's a bit of a tropical wave that's kind of right here that's also bringing some showers over northern parts of Venezuela. A tropical wave there, a tropical wave there. And it looks like maybe something is starting to roll off the African coast. So there's a lot of activity out there, but none of them are really showing a lot of convection. So probably we're going to watch those waves just continue to drift off toward the west. There were one or two models last week, at least model runs on the GFS. Of course, that's the one that goes out the farthest, that was not just indicating something developing in the southwestern Caribbean, but maybe one of those tropical waves developing something too. So we'll watch out for that, but that doesn't seem like the most likely situation. But this has been a very unusual hurricane season, so you really don't want to set your bets on a whole lot when it comes to what will and what won't develop. But at least at this time, the National Hurricane Center is recognizing that area of the southwestern Caribbean. And remember, we've been talking about it here on Acadiana Weather Today for a long time, but the National Hurricane Center, this is a 7-day tropical outlook. So last week when we were talking about this, it was outside of that 7-day window, but we always look at the Global Tropics Hazard Outlook too, which we'll get a fresh version of this sometime tomorrow afternoon. But last week when it was released, it was showing the possibility of that Western Caribbean being more of a hot zone for some tropical development. So that was kind of one of the first indications, that along with some of the extended computer models. But even going into the following week, this particular product does have some elevated anticipation of the possibility of some development there over the western part of the Caribbean Sea. But I will say that is where you would normally see tropical development going into the end of October and throughout the month of November. You probably know as you get into July and August, that's when, the Cape Verde season starts to open up, so you get those waves that come off the African coast. But it really starts to shrink back quite a bit as we get into November. This is more like what we would see during the month of June, and then things kind of expand, and then they contract back to the western part of the Atlantic and the western part of the Caribbean Sea. So wouldn't be, if you're going to see some development during this time of the year, those are the areas where it's going to be, and that's where the National Hurricane Center is pinpointing, as well as the Tropics Global Tropics Hazard Outlook too. It is also the area that tends to have the warmer waters this time of the year. While the Gulf of Mexico and the western part of the Atlantic, especially there along the coast, is now starting to see more of a cooling trend. In fact, all of our nearshore waters are now below 80 degrees, but you still got a considerable amount of 80-degree water that's over the Gulf of Mexico. That's anything shaded in yellow and brighter going into the reds and pinks. So the numbers that you see there in Celsius, so your magic number for 80 is about 26.5 degrees. Western part of the Caribbean, central and eastern part of the Caribbean, and much of the western Atlantic is still showing some water temperatures there in that 29 to 30 degree range in the on the Celsius scale. So you're getting upwards of 86 there, topping out over much of the Caribbean. So of course that is definitely warm enough to sustain any tropical activity. And the tropical cyclone heat potential, which is the measure of how deep those 80-degree waters go, still is pretty robust here over much of the Caribbean Sea. It's still on the high end of the scale here where you get that TCHP, but what we were looking at most of the hurricane season is much of the Gulf of Mexico was about the same color and had the same amount of cyclone heat potential, but you can see even that is starting to back off a little bit. It doesn't mean that it can't sustain a tropical system. You're just more likely not to have any rapid intensification as it churns up some of those cold or those warmer waters that are a little deeper under the surface. So again, all of the elements are there to still be able to produce tropical systems there over the western part of the Caribbean Sea. So let's just go through some of the model data here real quick. And we'll let the GFS kind of run. You've got a front that's going to come in on Thursday, and that's going to bring us a chance for some rain, and that front is going to be stalling, so you might get a secondary piece of energy coming through to bring us some more rain farther down the road. But you can see there's a bit of a low pressure area trying to develop there over the central part of the Caribbean, and then kind of turning it eastward toward Puerto Rico and Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and then sliding it off into the western part of the Atlantic Ocean. As that trough kind of pushes off the North American continent, it should keep any tropical weather away from the Gulf of Mexico. But I will say, compared to the model runs that we had last week, the GFS is developing this considerably farther east than what we were looking at. Last week, everything was kind of developing there. This week, it looks like it's trying to develop here and push it back out into the middle part of the Atlantic Ocean. And the final solutions actually kind of bring it up here close to the east coast of the U.S. and kind of a ridge pushes it back down in that particular direction. Could we have a weird meandering type of tropical system? It's possible. And we've seen some very strange tropical paths during the month of November anyway. As I was saying earlier, Eta was one of those that kind of came around here, went kind of like that, which was Tropical Storm Eta back in 2020. So you can get some crazy paths when it comes to tropical systems when you get into the latter part of the hurricane season. Here's the Euro model, and it's also showing more of a broad low pressure area trying to develop here, getting into the early part of November. So this is not going to be occurring until at the earliest Thursday or Friday, but more likely going into this upcoming weekend and the early part of next week. It's not real conclusive on where it's going to go after it develops, and the Euro model is really not showing anything particularly strong in the western part of the Caribbean. But the Canadian had a pretty robust solution earlier this morning, and this is the brand new model that just came down, and you can see you got low pressure developing a little bit closer to where the GFS was and then kind of lifting northward, and I think it would meander close to the U.S. coast but then eventually get kicked back out to sea. So right now I'm not real concerned with the U.S. coastline. It's going to be more of the Caribbean Sea that would be concerned about any of these tropical systems. I will say, though, that the last run of the Canadian model had a very strong hurricane right there where that L is, so considerably farther to the west. And it also is looking like that the Canadian model has backed off on the intensity here as well. So that is something that we will take into consideration. So not only are you looking at the path and the consistency from model run to model run, but you're also going to look at that intensity. And right now it's kind of going back and forth between something really strong and something very, very weak on the Canadian model. Now the icon doesn't go out quite as far, but remember the GFS is trying to develop something toward the end of this week. So we're in the range now with the icon model, and you can see there's a bit of a low. Again, trying to develop there over the far southwestern part of the Caribbean. Looks like it gains a little bit of strength going into the early part of next week and then tries to organize and move a little bit more similar to what the GFS and the Canadian. So I would say that I've got three models that are fairly in agreement that yes, we will probably see something develop. B, I think it will be in the central or maybe push into the central to eastern part of the Caribbean Sea. And all three models are showing enough of a pressure drop that it's a pretty good chance that what this is predicting here would get a name, and that would be Patty. But also look at some of the models where you see another secondary low there north of Puerto Rico. So will we get Patty and or Raphael? There's a possibility we could see that too. I will say that the Caribbean is probably going to be your best place for development when it comes to wind shear. Remember, wind shear tears apart developing tropical systems. If you have low wind shear, warm waters, and high heat content, those three things put together, you can sometimes get something to whip up pretty quickly, and they can get relatively strong in a short period of time. But when you have a considerable amount of wind shear, that tends to tear things apart in the development stage. So it really can't get its wheels going. It just kind of struggles along. And that's what we're looking at least right now. But this is kind of the average wind shear for the first week of November. And it's still fairly high over Cuba and the Bahamas, but you can see in the southwestern part of the Caribbean, it does back off a little bit. I wouldn't consider it low wind shear, but it would be moderate wind shear. So could we possibly get something to overcome that with the warmer waters out there? And that's why I think these latest runs of the model are indicating something a little bit weaker than what we were looking at Friday and over the weekend, where the wind shear was predicted to be a little bit lower. So wind shear might be more of an issue that would prevent any tropical activity to develop, or at least get anything really strong in that part of the world. So that is probably the most prime area where we're going to be able to see any kind of development, is the western part of the Caribbean. But I will say right now, the Gulf of Mexico looks like we're in the clear on this one, and the same thing goes with much of the eastern coast of the United States. So something that we'll be watching over the next several days, as hurricane season again doesn't end until November the 30th. So that's what I've got for you on this Monday. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on those notifications. That way we also know when my other show, Acadiana Weather Today, airs around 7:30 each weekday morning. And starting a week from today, my forecast will be heard on Big 102.1, Planet Radio 106.7, and Freedom 95.1. That'll be morning shows, midday, and afternoon drive. And in between the broadcasts on the radio or here on YouTube, make sure you follow my social media pages both on Facebook and X. Well, I'm meteorologist Dave Baker. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Monday, and I'll see you tomorrow morning for Acadiana Weather Today on Tuesday. Have a great day.